Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Jamie Gass, the Director of Pioneer Education. Welcome to our webinar about the Concord Review. In 1953, Winston Churchill told a young American, study history, study history. In history lie all the secrets of statecraft. Having written over 40 history books himself, not to mention being early in identifying both Hitler's Nazism and Stalin's communism as monstrous tyrannies, Sir Winston knew what he was talking about. Given his advice, Churchill would have agreed. Will Fitzhugh, founder of the Concord Review, is not only a wise man, but a great educator of young people. In truth, he's probably the wisest unsung person I've worked with in over 30 years around K-12 education policy. Decades ago, Will observed some basic truths about the grave deficiencies of American education and, in a high-minded and practical way, tried to remedy them with the Concord Review, a journal that publishes superb student essays in history. First, Will saw that many of the brightest students were in fact often bored to tears. The Nobel winner Saul Bellow called boredom the shriek of unused capacity. Humans are the history-making and storytelling animal. Passing along the basic stories and truths about our shared past is fundamental to humans' intellectual fulfillment and civic development in a democracy. Will got this basic reality about human learning and democracy and actually did something about it by engaging students with enduring academic excellence by having them read great historical narratives. As Churchill said, this changes young lives and future statecraft for the better. Clearly, we need more of that today. Second, Will also understood that despite the dramatic growth of state and national spending in K-12 education over the last 30 years, students were having fewer and fewer opportunities in schools to research and write high-quality history papers. This is another huge intellectual void in K-12 education that the Concord Review helps fill. In fact, Will's idea of students writing a page per year is a great and simple way to gradually build young people's capacity to write a 12-page paper by the time they graduate from high school. That is, 1 page in the first grade, 2 pages in the second grade, and so on until they graduate. This gets students to take history writing seriously while building an appreciation that being a good writer, like night follows day, first requires being a good reader. Finally, Will and the Concord Review remedy another central failing of American education, which is that it's too often about the adults. That is, 95% of education policy discussions are centered around the needs and interests of the adults who run the system, not the students they're intended to serve. Will's journal puts the superb academic work of students on a pedestal, elevating the aspirations of students above those of the narrow interests of the adults who too often dominate policymaking. You see, Will and the Concord Review uphold the idea that students themselves are uplifted by appreciating, understanding, and emulating the human excellence that's preceded them. It's by committing themselves to enduring standards of academic achievement that young people can search for the distinction within. Today, we're very fortunate to have with us 3 highly accomplished alumnae of the Concord Review. As you'll soon hear, these impressive young women are fantastic exemplars of a journal that ennobled their formative education by edifying their minds. To that end, we hope this webinar helps inform policymakers and education leaders alike, and why we're so honored to share this afternoon's lineup. Will Fitzhugh, founder of the Concord Review. Robert Nasson, editor of the Concord Review. Jessica Lee, Chief of Staff at Beacons. Whitney Toutenhoofd, Junior at Yale University. And Haripriya Mehta, co-founder of Mehta Plus. We're pleased to begin with a discussion with Will Fitzhugh.
Okay.
It's great to see you, Will, even if it's over Zoom. But so why don't we dig right in? I've got a series of questions and kind of help lead the conversation a little bit. But so I sort of touched on, Well, you founded the Concord Review in 1987. That was the year I graduated from high school, which was the bicentennial of the Constitution, 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Another time of increased concern about knowledge of history is right around the corner. Could you just give folks a sort of the context, some of the rationale for starting the Concord Review all those years ago?
Well, thanks very much for giving your time to this. I should say that Jamie Gass reads more history books than anyone else I know. In fact, he started reading history books in high school and then never stopped. And whenever I meet him, it's always a challenge because he says, "What are you reading?" And I have to say, "My God, what am I reading?" And I have to tell him what books I'm in the middle of at the moment. But I was teaching history in the high school at Concord, Massachusetts, and I was on sabbatical in 1987. And there was a great deal of concern in the country about history and academic writing and so on, as there always is. It just seemed to be especially strong at that point. And the situation I was in was that I had had students who did more than they had to. So my colleagues had told me to assign 5 to 7 page papers, but I had students turning in papers that were longer and better than that. And I began to realize that they were not interested in meeting my standards. They were interested in meeting their own standards. And it occurred to me that if those students were not the only ones in the country or in the world who were writing exceptional history research papers at the secondary level, that if I could induce some of them to send them to me, then I could publish them, and that those essays would be maybe a surprise and an inspiration to some of their peers. So in August of 1987, I sent a 4 page brochure to every high school in the United States and Canada and 1,500 schools overseas, basically asking for papers. And I was hoping for papers of 4 to 5,000 words because I was modeling those expectations on the International Baccalaureate. Well, it's been 36 years, and the papers are now averaging 9,000 words with sometimes 190 endnotes. And just in general, year after year, the work that we receive and have the privilege to publish is better than it was the year before. I mean, it just gets stronger and more interesting and so on. So that's what happened with that.
So just last year, we had the NAEP Civics and Nations Report Card, and it found that about 13% of American students are proficient in history and civics. Could you talk a little bit, sort of touched on a little bit in my remarks? Can you talk about sort of the importance of history and civics, and how this sort of informs a well-educated citizenry in our democracy?
Well, Americans have often thought more of the future than of the past. When I was at Cambridge, I was lucky enough to go to lectures by C.S. Lewis. And one of the things he said was that in the Middle Ages, people looked up to a glorious past of Plato and Socrates and Jesus and Cicero and all sorts of people in the past who were superstars. But he said the Renaissance came along, people started looking forward to a glorious future. And I think to some extent, Americans have done that. They've said, well, let's not worry about the past. Let's worry about where we're going next. Well, that's one general pattern. Another is that in the push among education leaders to improve performance in arithmetic and reading, social studies has fallen by the wayside. Less and less time is spent on social studies. So students graduate from high school in the United States without ever having read a single complete history book and without ever having written a serious history term paper. So that's how when they arrive at college, that's how unprepared they are. So it's a combination of ignorance of history and incompetence in writing that makes it hard for them to do as well as they should be able to do in education after school, after high school.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I mean, it's really given that the founders, when they set up and proposed public education in this country, that they really saw history and civics as sort of the mission or the wellspring of democratic citizenship. It's really kind of remarkable. So many high schools don't assign any history books to read or a history term paper, and yet colleges complain that students are arriving on campus with approximately a seventh grade reading and writing skills. Could you talk about how Concord Review helps to sort of remedy that and how, address that weakness?
Well, basically, all we do is provide examples of good work by their peers to anyone who runs across it. And we're finding more and more that essays we receive are written as independent studies, which means that they're basically a student is doing the work outside of class, and many without the knowledge of the teacher. We published a 20,000 word paper on the election of 1916 in the US. And I emailed the teacher and said, this is a great paper. He said, I don't know anything about this paper. So it's what these students are is what could be called autodidacts. They're teaching themselves history, and they're setting their own standards, and we're just sort of sitting back and enjoying the benefits. But I do think we have a number of letters from authors who say they've been inspired by the work of their peers. This happens in athletics all the time, but it doesn't happen as often in academics that students get to see the serious work of their peers.
Yeah, so we hear a lot about college and career readiness these days, and yet many companies are talking about how they have to initiate remedial writing courses for their employees. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of writing, but also the reading that precedes that? I mean, you've always been a big proponent of kids reading a substantive history book or a biography of a noted historical figure. Could you just talk about, in a very practical way, how being able to write and articulate yourselves with the written word is so important?
Well, when companies are spending a lot of money on, as you suggest, on remedial writing, and one of the problems is that employees write a memo and nobody knows what they said. And I was talking with one of our authors a short time ago who told me that the Pentagon is upset, is complaining now because the employees that they're getting can't read the manuals for equipment they're supposed to be servicing. So reading and writing are very essential skills, and for some reason we've let them slide. Now, one of the things I always say is that one of the problems is that in the schools, reading and writing are the province of the English department. And the English department likes fiction and personal writing and creative writing. And so, and the social studies departments, I will say, are happy to let the English department worry about it. So one of the reasons our students can't read very well is they haven't done any, and they can't write very well because they haven't done any. So if you want students to be able to read and write, you have to let them read and write. Otherwise, you'll never have it.
So the Concord Review history camps have now worked with almost 900 students from 17 countries and helped mentor them in preparation for serious history papers. Could you talk about it? I mean, I don't have the figures in front of me, but an enormous array of unbelievably accomplished students that publish pieces in the Concord Review over the years. Could you just give us some of the factoids? I know there's the number of schools, Ivy League educated kids that went through the Concord Review and published. Can you just talk about some of those accomplishments?
Well, we published essays from 48 countries, and the essays are not all about U.S. history. Some American students write about Asian history, and some Asian students write about American history. We don't tell them what to write about. So they pick their topics. And we do get papers by extraordinary students. And so what we were seeing is, often everybody says that STEM is what's important. Many of our authors are excellent in STEM. They're taking calculus and chemistry and physics, and they're doing the history paper on their own. autodidactically because they want to learn how to do it. They want to challenge themselves. So we're extraordinarily fortunate that these students who are pushed toward the sciences and math are doing that, but they also want to be competent in the liberal arts, especially history. But we've had some Rhodes Scholars. We've had a number of people who graduated one graduated early, Phi Beta Kappa at Yale and places like that. But we're happy that they're interested enough in history to take a paper like this on, as I say, mostly on their own without the help of the school.
I touched on it. Tell us a little bit more about the page per year and how you came up with that idea, which I think is great. And I can tell you, my own daughters during COVID, I was having them do that and have them write about Queen Elizabeth or Cicero or whatever. And I think they kind of looked at me with kind of in an unusual way. But just talk a little bit about that and how that would sort of build logically so that kids would be prepared for the kind of writing that they were going to need to do in college.
Well, probably one influence was the fact that kids begin Little League at 9 years old. They begin Pop Warner football at whatever, 9 years old, whatever it is. So that by the time they're seniors in high school, they've had decades of experience in their sport. But sometimes high school teachers will say, oh, my students can't write a 12-page paper. I mean, many of the papers we publish are 36 pages. But anyway, they say, my students can't write a 12-page paper. So what I like to say to them is, well, what if they wrote an 11-page paper the year before, and a 10-page paper the year before that, and a 9-page paper the year before that? They wouldn't be intimidated by the idea of a 12-page paper. So it's just, if we want somebody to be a good football player, we start them young. We want them to be a good historian, or, start them young. So that's basically the idea, is just copy what works in other disciplines, let them start young and get better as they get older.
No, I know, and we've done a lot of events, and you've participated in several of them when you have these Pulitzer Prize winning historians, and some of them get some pretty good speaking fees. If someone had told me when I was in high school that you could make $10,000 for a 40-minute speech, I probably would have studied a little harder. But both with the the Concord Review academic coaches, and which you've been doing that for 10 years or more. Provide a lot of individual coaching for serious history students. Could you talk about that, as well as some of the kind of the Concord Review history seminars that do that work with middle schoolers to help discuss and write about history books?
Well, you're giving me a great opportunity. And I did fail to mention about the history camps, that when students come to the history camp, we don't talk to them about history. We help them write a paper. It's a working camp. It's a workshop. And I mean, they spend most of their time working on their paper. So similarly I mean, obviously in the TCR academic coaches, the student is spending most of the time. The most important thing is to write the paper, read the book and write the paper and so on. We do have the beginnings of a middle school history seminar, the idea of which is for a group of middle school students to get together online and read history books and discuss them. So there again, why wait till you're a senior in college to read a history book? Why not read one when you're in the 5th grade? And the kids have been very enthusiastic about it, and the instructors have enjoyed it immensely, which, people often do when they work with young people and they get them thinking and talking. They say, oh, that's something I never thought of. These kids are smarter than I thought they were. So that's been a very good experience. And we want to start something called the TCR Academy, because most high school social studies teachers did not major in history. So most of them never wrote a history paper. So what we want to do is to give social studies teachers, high school social studies teachers, a chance to write a paper. The idea being that if they get that satisfaction, they'd be more likely to want their students to have the same experience. And we've started with a couple of teachers from Kazakhstan, and we hope to have more next summer. But there again, it's a change from most professional development, which is universally despised. So because teachers don't come and get talked to. They come and work on a project of their own, which they will take pride in. So that's the plan for the future of that.
Sounds great. So I've got two more questions before we turn things over to Robert and the panel. But really going back to Sputnik in the late 50s, there's been an enormous emphasis on STEM.
Sure.
Of course, people forget that as poorly as the country, we're about 25th in the world in STEM. As poorly as we do in STEM, the reality is the nation's report card shows that in history we're even lower performing, which is sort of odd, right? Because both Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were both unbelievably well educated in the humanities, excellent writers, and knew Newtonian physics and were inventors and stuff. Could you talk about that? How, even if you're going into the STEM fields, how being able to write in a clear and concise way, why that training and in reading history and writing about history is so indispensable for even people in the STEM fields?
Well, even before we get to history, I've had a number of engineers say, when I say to them, even engineers and scientists need to read and write, they say very strongly, yes. And they talk about how difficult it is to get anywhere in the sciences or in engineering if people can't understand what other people are writing. It's the same thing we were talking about before with memos. So if you can't read and write, you're not going to be as successful in the STEM fields. And I also think it's, your intellectual life is impoverished if you don't know any history. And that includes history of science, by the way. I think a number of engineers and scientists are interested in the history of their field, if nothing else. So it's very important not to push reading, writing, and history to the side because you think you're more important to spend time on math and science.
Agree. So here's a final question. Of course, everyone is wringing their hands. They look across the landscape, and a lot of the political figures are not always that eloquent or that well educated in history. But of course, we have examples of Theodore Roosevelt, who wrote 40 or 50 books. Winston Churchill wrote 40 or 50 books. But there's a great quote here from John Adams, who, of course, was maybe among the best read of the founders in the area of history and political science and law. He said, "Dare to read, think, speak, and write." Could you talk about this this relationship, this really vital relationship between the work that you've done at the Concord Review and how reading, understanding, and writing about history is so fundamental to statesmanship and to being an informed citizen?
Well, we could try to take an example from James Madison, who asked Thomas Jefferson to send him 200 books from Paris because he was studying the history of republics. And he was trying to figure out a way to design a constitution for a republic that could survive. So he thought history was very important to doing his job. And I think, in continuing the job that he provided for us, we have to continue to honor history and to take advantage of that knowledge in trying to sustain the republic that he gave us.
Well, I couldn't say it any better than that. And I want to reiterate again how grateful I am to you for your work. It's really, frankly, heroic work. And in the work that I do around education policy, can always point to the exemplar that you've provided for people and the opportunities you provided for young people to showcase their history. So I'm really grateful. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robert and the panel.
Thanks, Jamie. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Just to explain a little bit more about my background, I know you introduced me at the beginning, but I am the current editor of the Concord Review. I've been the editor for the past year and a half now, but my involvement with the organization goes back over 20 years. I started interning at the Journal my junior going into senior year of college. I was fortunate enough to be hired by Will upon graduation from college. And then I worked with the Concord Review for about 9 years until I left to go to another nonprofit. And then I came back about 3.5 years ago. So my time with the Journal goes back a long ways. But the first time that I actually heard about the Concord Review, and it ties in well into what we're talking about today, was when I was in my AP US history class my junior year at Lexington High School. And my teacher, Mary Keenan, I still remember her name, on one of the first days or first weeks of class, held up a copy of the Concord Review. I did not know anything about it, and said, all of you should read the Journal, and all of you should try to submit a paper to get published in the Journal. I remember getting the Journal from her, maybe, a few days later, and looking through it and saying, hey, this is really, really interesting. This is history being done by students my age. And, I think I had the benefit of growing up in Lexington where there's just so much local history, but I remember the Concord Review really piquing my interest in history in a way that it hadn't been before, just because it was something that was being done by my peers. And when I came across the internship, my junior going into senior year of college, I remember thinking back to that AP US history class and saying, hey, I really enjoyed reading the Journal, and I think a lot of it. I'm going to apply for this position, and here I am today as the editor. So that's just a little backstory about myself. I am joined today on this panel by 3 former authors, Whitney, Jessica, and Haripriya, who were published a few years back and are still involved in the Concord Review in various ways. Whitney is an instructor with our history camps that Will and Jamie talked about. Jessica oversees her academic coaching service and is also a board member. And Haripriya is a coach who helps high school students work on their history papers. We're going to spend the next 30 minutes talking about the Concord Review, the papers that they published when they were in high school, the process that went into writing those papers, how doing this type of work has helped them both in college and professionally, and then also spend just a little time talking about why history is such an important subject for high school students to study, really. I think that there's such an emphasis on STEM and English and other subjects at the high school level that often history gets overlooked. So I'm going to open it up. I'm going to actually ask Haripriya, this is going to be for you first. I know you wrote your paper on Sardar Patel. Do you mind sharing some more about your paper and how you chose to write about Patel?
Yeah, so my paper was on Sardar Patel, who's the Indian freedom fighter that a lot of people don't know about. The reason I got interested in writing about him was because in high school, the Statue of Unity, which is currently the tallest statue that has been built, it was undergoing construction. And so I was curious who this historical figure is, because everyone knows about Gandhi and Nehru, but who was Sardar Patel? And I had heard a lot of my aunts and uncles when I was in India say how he was actually elected to a position that was going to be the first prime minister of India, but he was undemocratically stepped aside for Nehru. So that's basically what my paper is about.
Thanks, Haripriya. Whitney, I'm going to turn it over to you. We published your paper about 3 years ago on home rule in Scotland. What got you interested in that topic?
Yeah, thank you. At the time, this would have been the time that I started writing this paper was in fall of 2019. So yeah, about 4 years ago is when I started writing it. And at the time, there was a lot in the news about Brexit and about the sort of in response to that, the possibility of like this Scottish independence movement. And that was something that I really had like no prior knowledge about. My mom's side of the family is Scottish, so it was something I was sort of interested in just from like a personal family perspective. But that sort of just like hearing about that in the news as a current event got me interested in like the history of Scottish independence movements in the past and sort of the history of just that relationship between Scotland and England. So that was really kind of the genesis for that project.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And then finally over to you, Jessica. Your paper was on Kong Yu Wei and his attempts at institutional reform in late 19th century China. Can you explain a little bit more about him and why you decided to write your paper on his impact?
Yeah, totally. So I'd always been really interested in Chinese history since I'm Chinese and my parents came from China. I also grew up in China. So I was always really fascinated by Chinese history. And in 10th grade, a year before I wrote my paper, I had done a deep dive into different aspects of Chinese history, and Kong Yu kept coming up as someone who was the main person who was successful at getting reforms, albeit for a short period of time, through the country. And so I was just really curious about how he was able to be so effective when others had failed, especially because he came from sort of a humble background. He failed the civil service exam. He didn't have a very rich family, wasn't part of the elite by any means. And so really wanted to better understand how he was able to get through to the elites and the people in power, including the royal family themselves, and learned in short that he was able to essentially cast reform in a Confucius light, which was super critical for it to be palatable for the more traditional members of society who are also often the most powerful. And so just thought it was a very interesting strategy and wanted to dive deeper into it.
Thanks, Jessica. And I think that we didn't set it up this way, but Will had mentioned just the fact that with the Concord Review, you can submit your paper on any historical topic. And I think, the three topics that you all wrote about are all, different in various ways. And sometimes people think, oh, does it just have to be about US history? And I think the really unique thing about the Concord Review is, we always say to students, just get interested in something. And we know that if a student is interested in a subject, it's going to carry them through this process of writing this paper. The process. So, all of your papers were, I think, 20 plus pages long. I think, Haripriya, yours is like 35 pages long. So we're talking about a substantial amount of reading and writing. It's certainly not an assignment that you can just, slap together overnight and turn it in, or, do it on one weekend, or even probably do it in 1 month. What's this process like, Jessica? What was it like for you to sort of, go deep into your subject and, start with just finding out as much information as possible all the way through like the writing process? Like, could you sort of walk us through that and sort of the things you enjoyed and maybe the challenges as well too?
Yeah, totally. I think what I enjoyed the most about it was sort of similar to the same reasons why I really liked writing my thesis in college. It was that it was an unsolved problem. Obviously, there's like different papers on the topic, so it's not completely greenfield. But I think it was a nice blend of having existing resources out there that were available to me to use as research, as fodder for my paper, but still answering this new question that I had come up with. Because I think in school, so often you're given a very specific prompt and it's so constrained, or there's like an answer or correct answer, and you're just writing like one word stuff or a paragraph or a couple sentences. And it just felt like with this, I was like charting new territory. And especially in high school when you're relatively young, that's super exciting and also super different from what you experience in school. So I think that's what I like the most. I suppose the challenge was sort of actually doing that, because obviously it's very exciting, but as with most exciting things, it's also very hard and daunting even. And so I think a lot of it was the challenge was figuring figuring out from like sort of first principles, like what are the resources that I can use? Like how do I get them? How do I read them? How do I think about them? How do I bring them together? And so I think a lot of it was information gathering, sourcing, and synthesis. And I think it was a good lesson in like learning how to really dive deep into a topic, since I think in school, when you're like, you know, high school, especially like taking like, I don't know, 5, 6 classes and like homework every day, everything ends up being like rather superficial. And you rarely get a chance to become a true expert in a subject. And I really liked that I was able to do it with this particular project.
Jessica, you were in 10th grade when you wrote this paper?
11th grade.
11th, okay. Had
going
you
into
done
11th.
something similar before, or was this sort of your first venture into this type of research project?
Yeah, so I'd done like research in other fields, specifically like science and math, and written like longer papers, as well for school, but this was definitely like the first one of its size and its depth in the humanities that I had done.
Excellent. Haripriya, what was it like for you? You know, how long did it take you to sort of do it from start to finish? Did you ever get the feeling of like, you know, where am I going with this? Like, how do I tie it all together? You know, could you just explain what it was like?
Yeah, most definitely. So it took me 3.5 years. I submitted it literally right before I left for the graduation ceremony in my senior year. But I started researching the summer after ninth grade. So there were definitely stretches of times where I'm like, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go with this. So I took breaks. But then when I would, look back at it with sort of fresh, from a fresh perspective, I was able to work on it and eventually get it done.
Mm-hmm. 3.5 years, that could be the longest that I've heard someone work on it for. So kudos to you for that. And then Whitney, I would ask you sort of a similar question to what I just asked Haripriya and Jessica. If there are other students, high school students listening to this now or down the road, what would you want them to know about taking on like an academic project of this scope? Like what advice would you give to them?
I mean, well, I'll just speak a bit to my personal experience because so I had started a paper on the same topic or a very related topic for a class that was a much shorter paper that I was just assigned in my junior year history class. And I had just done like a lot of extra research and I was like really feeling inspired about like doing more than this paper was kind of just asking of me based on what I was finding in my research. And so this paper, or the opportunity to write a paper for the Concord Review that was really, as long as I wanted it to be, felt like an opportunity to really like see the project through and really put that research that I had invested so much time into like an actual form of something that I was proud of. And so I would say that overall, even though it was a very like challenging and time consuming experience, that overall it was like a very gratifying and satisfying experience. And that is what I would imagine writing a paper of that length would be like for so many high school students. I think so many more high school students are capable of that kind of writing than maybe they're told that they are, or since so few high school students ever really are asked to write papers of that length. It's not something that we necessarily believe very many of them are capable of, but I guess if I were to give advice to other high school students, as kind of cheesy as it may sound, it would just be like, it's worth it. You can do it. It's totally within, I think, most high school students' capabilities to produce something like that. And it's just such a gratifying experience to have that happen in high school.
So basically you're saying you may not fully appreciate it in the moment when you're doing it, but once it's done and, years afterwards or months afterwards, you'll start to realize just how much it has helped you, or at least was worthwhile to do an endeavor of this sort.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Whitney, how do you hear about the Concord Review? I'm just curious. Was it a teacher? Or did you just find it, online? And did someone else at your school get published? I'm just always curious to know about that.
I think that I heard about it. I think I did find it online, but then I also, maybe also online, found out that a couple students from my high school had been published in the past. And so it was probably the combination of, yeah, just finding it kind of spontaneously online, but then also knowing that this was something that other students from my school had also submitted to that.
Mhm.
inspired
What were
me.
what were your first impressions? Do you remember, or were you,
First, I
impression?
mean, I remember thinking this is like such a long shot, but also seems like the perfect sort of excuse for me to really, put this research that I've done into this like product that, that I really want to create. So yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we hear that from students when they get published. They sort of extend what they're working on based on the fact that they wanted to get published, but they still, when they submit it, they're like, oh, chances are pretty slim still. But I think once it's published, they realize just how much work they actually did. Sometimes you don't realize it until after the fact almost. Haripriya, what were your first impressions? Did the Concord Review, you talked about working on your paper for, 3+ years. Did it serve as a motivating factor? Like, were you like, I'm gonna, make this even longer or more in depth with the hope of being published?
Yeah, so my first impressions, wow, it was, wow, this is challenging, because this is the first time I had, taken on a project of this size. I had not taken any project in any sort of other, class or anything like that. And I was the first student from my school writing for the Concord Review. So it was definitely challenging. But I guess, yeah, it was definitely motivating for me to know that, hey, this finished project, this finished paper is sort of like this finish line that I need to get to. Like, even if I don't get published, I would have learned so much about my heritage. I would have learned how to research. I would have read so many books that I otherwise wouldn't have gotten a chance to. But obviously, being published and like waiting for, oh, is it going to get, published or not? That was definitely like a cherry on top.
That's good to hear that. And Jessica, how about you? How did you hear of the journal? Was it friend, teacher, someone at your school who had been published previously?
So I found out about it through researching different opportunities for high school students. I think back when I was in 8th grade and planning like my years in high school, and it came up as just this amazing opportunity in the top one in humanities, and just the only journal that focuses specifically on high school students, and felt like it was really unique to be able to possibly get a chance to be published so early on, when that maybe doesn't happen for a lot of people until like college earliest, or even like PhDs, postdocs, etc. So that's how I first heard about it.
Yeah, that's the way, we still have a lot of people who just students will reach out to us and say, I just was researching, looking up online history journals, and your name popped up, the Concord Review. I talked to a student from Pakistan 2 weeks ago, and he never heard of us, and he looked for us online, and he said he was writing a paper that was 13,000 words now, and he ended up submitting it 2 weeks ago. So there's still a lot of that just organic, people searching on the internet and never hearing of the Concord Review, and all of a sudden they're, submitting their paper that they've worked on for, 6 months, 9 months, a year plus. Jessica, I wanted to ask you sort of a follow-up question. I know Whitney touched on it a little bit around how high school students may not think they're capable of this type of work, but they, could be, or at least, in doing something similar. Maybe it's not, 25 pages, could be 15, 18 pages. I know I hear, and Will has heard this a lot over the years from teachers or some high school students that say the Concord Review is too advanced. I can't do this type of work. Therefore, what's the point of even, looking at it, really? What would you say to a teacher who said that?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One is that the journal itself and having existed for so many decades and publishing, 4 times a year with so many great articles is a testament, an example of its sort of existence proof of high schoolers being able to achieve this. So that's point number one. I think the second point is that a lot of times there's just this like mental barrier. I think sometimes like these things can be self-fulfilling prophecies if you or the people around you, especially teachers, tell you or believe or say or otherwise exhibit behavior that implies that you can't do it, then you'll think you can't do it. Whereas if you just believe and know that it's possible and don't think of it as this like gargantuan, like crazy task and just like, an endeavor that's feasible for you, then you can achieve it. I think a lot of it has to do with mindset. It sounds cheesy, but I do think it's quite true. And I think the third thing that I would say is even if, like you said, you don't get to 25 pages or even 20 pages or you don't get published, the fact that you tried, it's not a binary outcome. It's not like, oh, if you reach 25, suddenly you get all the benefits. And if you're 24, then you get nothing. It's very much like a sliding scale and a spectrum where you can get so many benefits, even if you're not published, even if your paper isn't super long or, meets certain length criteria. You still learn a lot about doing research, about communication, about gathering sources, about reading about the specific topic and really become an expert on that topic, regardless of the outcome. So there's a ton of benefit in the process itself that spills over to class, to other subject areas, and to really the rest of your life. So I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I know I'm a little biased, obviously, as the editor, but I will say to teachers sometimes, we're not, the expectation isn't necessarily for, all of your students or even, a couple of your students to be published, but I still think doing this type of work is going to help them in college and beyond. And I think back to when I was in high school, I was inspired by the journal and I ended up writing, I think it was like a 12 or 13 page paper. It wasn't good enough to get published. I didn't submit it. And you were right, I think, in saying like there's sort of a mental barrier that you can create sometimes because it was the longest paper that I had written by far. I think the longest before that was probably 5 or 6 pages. And, it was challenging, but once I completed it, I remember getting to college and I was like, all right, I'm more ready to handle some of the work that's going to come at me now. And if you don't have that experience in high school, it's sort of, you're in for a rude awakening. I think once you get to college with that. Haripriya, what would you say to, a student who might look at the journal and be like, well, I've only done 8 pages. These essays are 20 pages. No, thanks. I'm not going to even look at this anymore. And, it's too good for me, or, it's not worth even thinking about.
Yeah, well, first of all, there's so many volumes of Concord Review papers, and they're all written by high school students that are just like them. We don't have any superpowers or anything. It is definitely, it's a long process, but if you are dedicated, if you take it step by step, you don't need to write 20 pages all in one day, right? You can take it, write a few pages in a month, and then write a few other pages in the next month. It's quite doable. So just keep at it, and also choose a project that you are really passionate about, because then you stop thinking about, I still have so many more pages to write. You just want to research.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. I always tell that to students, like pick a subject that you're interested in, or else it's going to be really, really painful to do something like this. And you probably will give up halfway through. So that's a very good point that you made. Talking about how it helps you later on, Whitney, I know we were just talking about you're at EL right now, wrapping up finals. Has writing, reading history books, doing the research, writing a paper, has it helped you in college at all?
Oh, absolutely. I can say with like 100% certainty that writing this particular paper in high school was like the number one thing that prepared me for writing at the college level. So I really think that is arguably the primary like benefit to students of producing papers like this in high school, is that it really just does prepare you so much for college. And that's regardless if you're published, regardless regardless if you even like finish the paper or submit it anywhere, just that practice in writing is so valuable and will serve you so much down the line.
Mhm. And Jessica and Haripriya, I know you are both in the working world now. Jessica, do you feel like what you did back in 11th grade you still use some of those skills in your current job? I know you work in the technology sector. People might not think a history research paper will have anything to do with that, or, has any relation. Do you find that you still use some of those skills in your current job? Maybe not every day, but from time to time?
Yeah, definitely. I think in a lot of different ways. I think, for example, in one way, whenever we're looking to dive into new spaces or build products in new areas, obviously AI is all the rage these days. And we're looking into how to build AI tools for content creators, which is the market that we serve at our company. And part of that process that I'm leading is just doing research on what's out there, on what's useful for creators, on their workflows, their pain points, their priorities. And it's quite similar to doing history research. And then obviously after that research, I need to communicate it to my team, can't live in my head. And so that process of like taking that research and transferring it to paper in a way that's engaging and understandable and logical to other people is super critical. I think also content in general is a big part of a lot of companies, more and more so now and in the future, their brand, their marketing, their positioning, their growth strategy, and just the main way in which they connect with possible and current customers. And so I'm leading our content strategy. That's pretty multimedia, but involves a lot of written content as well. And so I think definitely a lot of the lessons learned from the Concord Review transfers to that. And so definitely see it as very valuable, even in my job now.
Thanks, Jessica. And Haripriya, I'll let you sort of finish on that too. In your work, I believe you work with Microsoft. You still use the skills, to what you did over those 3.5 years writing this paper. Do you still find them useful in your current line of work?
100%, because whenever we're starting new projects, even if they're software engineering projects, we are essentially working with other human beings, and we have to sell our ideas and make sure that, that they agree with you and that they want you to, continue working on those ideas. And I think reading and writing about history taught not only how to present myself, but also I learned a lot from historical figures of, from their mistakes and failures and successes, and kind of incorporating that in my life to try to get people onboarded to my ideas.
Thank you. So we're coming up at the top of the hour. I have one final question that I'd like to ask have all three of you answer. It's more of a broader one. And Will and Jamie talked about this a little bit at the end of their conversation. But there's so much emphasis at the high school level on STEM and English and other academic subjects that sometimes history gets overlooked. And there have been obviously surveys that have showed that high school students don't know a lot about history. From time to time, people will say to me, "Oh, in the Concord Review, it's really cool, but how can this be used later on? What can a history degree, how does it get you a job, or what's the point of it, 5, 10 years down the road?" I know you have all touched upon how it has helped you both in college and your professional life, but just from a standpoint of, a citizen of this country, as someone who, having more knowledge about our past, why is it important for high school students to have some basic understanding of, both U.S. history and the world's history, really? And why, if they do not, is that a problem for us, really? Whitney, I'll open with you on that. I know it's sort of broad, but I'm hoping you sort of give your opinion on why it's really crucial for high school students to know something about the past.
Yeah. Well, I think there's so many different ways that, and so many different reasons I could give for why it's important to study history. But one thing that I'm thinking about right now is just even the way that the academic discipline of history and what it asks you to do constructing a history paper, I think actually really teaches empathy and or at least like helps construct like the ability for empathy and the ability to disagree respectfully, because all of historical writing is like weighing multiple opinions and sort of coming to like a nuanced conclusion based on sometimes conflicting perspectives. And I think that that's just a really valuable like life human skill, regardless of if you're applying that to like academic writing or just like relationships in your life. So I feel like just in terms of like being a good human, it teaches a lot of skills that are just applicable in so many different ways.
Yeah, I think that nuance and empathy is definitely in short supply these days too. So, we could talk about that more later. But Jessica, how about you? What do you think? If you're talking to high school students and they're like, "Well, history, I want to get involved in STEM and English and whatever else, and history's not something that I really care about, and why is it important for me to know about it?" What would you say to them?
Yeah, I think I would say that history is really the foundation of everything. Like, even if you want to, dive into biology or physics or math or whatever STEM area, or even English, like, you need to learn about, let's say it's English, like past literary giants, or even just ones in particular niches that you're excited about. If you want to dive into math, you need to learn about the most important solved and unsolved problems and the stories behind the people who solved them, how they were able to do it, what they did to solve it, who helped them, etc. And that's obviously true for other areas of the sciences as well. And so I'd say history is really, obviously it's its own subject, but I'd say it's also a part of really anything else that you'd like to learn. And in that way, it's really critical as just like this foundational building block to be able to get better and be informed on anything you do in these other areas, because obviously this isn't the beginning of the universe or the world. So much has happened, and if you don't take the time to learn about the history of even just your fields that you're trying to dive into, then you're going to be doing everything without the proper context, which makes a lot of the things that you do or think through kind of useless at the end of the day. And so I think I'd say it's really the foundation of these other fields.
Thanks, Jessica. That's well said. And Haripriya, I'll let you take us home with the sort of final comment on this, and then I'll pass it back over to Jamie.
Yeah, I totally agree with the points on empathy and just knowing the history of your field. Also, something high school students should think about is that they're going to be voting very soon. And so to understand public policy, to understand sort of the historical background and the context is incredibly important, because the laws that the lawmakers are passing, that's going to impact your life and your job. And so knowing the historical context behind all of that is very important.
Thanks, Haripriya. I want to thank you all again for joining us this afternoon. Whitney, Jessica, Haripriya, really enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate all that you continue to do for the Concord Review, and I hope that everyone who has tuned in today has enjoyed the conversation. Jamie, I want to pass it back to you at this point, since I know it's coming right up at 3:00.
Well, thank all of you. You can, I think, begin to see. I mean, I'm a board member, and so I certainly, at the Concord Review, you can see why I'm such a big fan of it. This is obviously an enormously impressive group of young women, and the work that Will has done for a long time really speaks for itself. But before we close, I just want to show you a copy of it. It's right here, and even by you read some of the titles. This is the fall 2023 edition. It's U.S. Merchant Marine, the Salem Witchcraft Trial, Treaty of Versailles, Chinese Burial. These authors are from Florida, South Korea, India, Hong Kong, Massachusetts, and the United Kingdom. And you just realize, I mean, we are living in a global world and in civilization in so many ways. And the work that these young women and these other authors have done, and that Will has been publishing for decades, just has an enormous number of incalculable applications. And it's so vitally important to our democratic way of life, the free exchange of ideas. and just living a good life. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what an education is really about. And I think that these unbelievably impressive folks have explained to you why this is so vitally important to a good life. So with that, I want to thank everyone for participating and for listening. This will be available on pioneerinstitute.org, our website. We're going to make it available on YouTube. And I would encourage you to subscribe or engage, or other young people you know, to submit these essays to the Concord Review. It's really just a wonderful organization, and Will and team really deserve just an enormous amount of credit for producing it for so many decades. And with that, thanks so much.